The manicured streets of Buckhead always smelled faintly of blooming hydrangeas, freshly cut St. Augustine grass, and polite hostility. Driving down West Pace's Ferry Road, past the wrought iron security gates and neoclassical brick estates, I felt the familiar constriction behind my ribs. It was an involuntary physical reflex, one honed by 27 years of being the sole discordant note in the Vance family symphony. In my family, appearance was not merely a priority, it was an article of faith. If a tragedy occurred behind closed doors, it did not exist until the neighbors caught wind of it. If a victory could not be photographed, catalogued, and casually dropped into conversation at the Cherokee Town and Country Club, it was deemed a failure. I parked my 4-year-old Subaru Outback in the circular driveway of my parents' 2-story Georgian residence, against the polished backdrop of my father's slate-gray Mercedes-Benz S-Class and a gleaming brand-new midnight blue Porsche Taycan that sat squarely under the portico. My vehicle looked like a clerical error. I took a slow, deep breath, adjusted the collar of my charcoal knit sweater, and walked inside. The foyer was cool and redolent of expensive white lilies. My mother, Eleanor Vance, stood near the marble console table in the grand hall, arranging cream-colored hydrangeas in a cut crystal vase. She was 56, with every silver strand of hair relentlessly highlighted into a golden blonde bob, wearing a tailored linen sheath dress that suggested she had just completed a photo shoot for a high-end lifestyle magazine. She turned as the front door latched shut. Her gaze made the customary downward sweep, evaluating my flat loafers, my minimal makeup, the absence of designer hardware on my leather tote, before rising to meet my eyes with a practiced razor-thin smile. "Kendall," she said, offering her cheek for a dry air-kiss embrace. "You're cutting it dangerously close. The catering staff had the past hors d'oeuvres ready 20 minutes ago. I assumed you might want to arrive early to fix your hair." "Traffic on Georgia 400 was backed up, Mother," I replied calmly. "Good evening." "Well, try to look a bit more animated tonight, dear." Preston's parents couldn't make it down from Greenwich, but he's had an extraordinary week, and Harper is walking on air. The least we can do is offer a supportive environment. My father, Arthur Vance, emerged from his study down the wood-paneled hallway, holding an amber glass of scotch. At 62, he possessed the broad, authoritative posture of a retired corporate litigator who still believed the world operated as his personal courtroom. "Kendall," he said with a curt nod. He didn't move to hug me. "Good to see you found the time. How is whatever it is you do in your apartment going? Still looking into legitimate corporate placement, I hope." "My quantitative analytics contracts are steady, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. He offered a dismissive wave of his hand, swirling his ice cubes. "Freelance dabbling. A girl with your mathematics degree from Vanderbilt should be managing a desk at SunTrust or Morgan Stanley, not sitting in sweatpants, typing algorithms for nameless entities. Look at Preston. That boy is 31 and already commanding an 8-figure private equity pipeline. That is what the structure looks like." Before I could reply, the French doors leading to the veranda swung open, carrying with them the sound of melodic, high-pitched laughter. My older sister Harper floated into the room. At 29, Harper was the golden child, a former sorority president, a luxury real estate marketer, and the living embodiment of our mother's aesthetic ambitions. Her diamond eternity band caught the chandelier light as she looped her arm through that of the man beside her, Preston Sterling. Preston looked like central casting had been tasked with creating an Ivy League hedge fund prodigy. He wore a bespoke navy blazer with horn buttons, an open-collared Egyptian cotton shirt, and Italian suede loafers without socks. His dark hair was meticulously sculpted with matte pomade, and his smile had that practiced, radiant warmth of a man who knew precisely how charming he was being paid to appear. "Kendall," Harper chimed, sweeping over to press her cheek against mine, while ensuring her freshly blown-out hair remained undisturbed. "You made it. We were just telling Mom and Dad about the venue walkthrough at the Blue Ridge Mountain Estate. It is going to be breathtaking. The glass pavilion overlooking the valley at sunset. Honestly, I cried when we signed the contract." "It's a solid property," Preston added, his voice a rich baritone purr designed to command boardrooms. He extended a manicured hand toward me. "Good to see you again, Kendall. Still running those numbers from the home office?" "I am," I said, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was firm, theatrical, and lingered a second too long for effect. Fascinating, he murmured, though his eyes were already scanning the room, making sure Arthur and Eleanor were watching him interact with their lesser daughter with benevolent condescension. There's a quaint simplicity to gig work. Low overhead, zero administrative pressure. Sometimes I envy that freedom when I'm managing liquidity calls across 3 time zones before breakfast. My mother beamed at him as if he had just recited Shakespeare. You work too hard, Preston, darling. Let's move into the dining room. Dinner is served. The dining table was set with heirloom sterling silver Noritake porcelain and heavy crystal goblets. As we took our seats, the dynamic fell into its predictable, suffocating groove. My father sat at the head. Preston was seated to his right, with Harper beside him. My mother sat at the opposite end, and I was placed to the left, a spectator seated in the gallery of their mutual admiration society. The dinner began with a chilled leek and potato soup, followed by roasted tenderloin. For 45 minutes, the conversation was an uninterrupted monologue, delivered by Preston, punctuated by fawning gasps from my mother, and vigorous approving nods from my father. Preston spoke grandly of his boutique investment vehicle, Sterling Point Capital. He dropped the names of private equity titans in Manhattan, hinted at exclusive venture rounds in Silicon Valley, and casually referenced off-market commercial acquisitions in downtown Atlanta. The modern financial landscape is about agility, Preston declared, cutting into his beef with surgical precision. Traditional banks are lumbering dinosaurs. What our high-net-worth clients want is proprietary algorithmic hedging paired with cross-border liquidity access. We delivered 32% annualized returns across our primary alpha fund last quarter alone. In this macroeconomic climate that isn't just performance, it's alchemy. 32%. Arthur repeated, his chest swelling with vicarious pride. Unbelievable. The partners at my old firm are thrilled if they hit 8% in index funds. It takes vision, Preston, absolute vision. It takes discipline, Arthur, Preston corrected gently, wearing a modest, self-effacing grin. And knowing when to seize an asymmetric market opportunity. I sat quietly, chewing slowly, letting the jargon wash over me. In my professional life, the life my parents knew absolutely nothing about, because they had never cared to ask beyond why I didn't have an office badge. I worked as a senior quantitative risk analyst for a premier institutional macro fund based in Manhattan. I spent 10 hours a day stress testing collateralized structures, tracking liquidity ratios, and modeling derivative systemic failures. I had spent years dissecting financial architecture, and what Preston was describing was absolute unadulterated nonsense. At first, it was small things. He referenced an exempt cross-collateralization bridge that violated basic SEC Rule 144 requirements. A few moments later, he boasted about managing proprietary depository routing through an offshore custodian while claiming full exemption from FinCEN reporting, a legal impossibility, unless one was actively running an unregistered shell network. His vocabulary was a patchwork quilt of financial buzzwords harvested from podcast clips, LinkedIn thought leadership essays, and boiler room sales pitches. It was polished, it was confident, and it was entirely hollow. I didn't say a word. I kept my eyes on my plate. Then, as the catering attendant cleared the entree dishes and poured the dessert wine, the spotlight turned. It was time for the evening's blood sport. So, Kendall, Preston began, leaning back and resting his forearm on the table, looking across at me with a smirk that dripped with condescending amusement. Harper tells me you've been spending your weeks doing remote data entry contracts. Tell me, do you ever plan on getting a real job, or are you just holding out for universal basic income? A collective titter of laughter rippled across the table. My mother let out a sharp, tinkling laugh into her linen napkin. Harper giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured fingers. My father chuckled deeply into his wineglass, shaking his head with the weary amusement of a patriarch whose disappointing child had just been appropriately roasted. Preston, don't tease her, Harper said, though her eyes were glittering with satisfaction. Kendall likes her little routine. She doesn't have the ambition for the corporate rat race. Some people are just built for quiet, modest lives. No, I'm serious, Preston continued, raising his hands in mock innocence. I respect it truly. While the rest of us are out here carrying the weight of market volatility, managing 7-figure payrolls, and generating real economic value, Kendall is living the dream. sitting at home in her pajamas, completely unburdened by performance metrics or quarterly audits. Unemployed in everything but name. It must be nice to have so much free time while the adults run the world. The insult hung in the air, wrapped in a veneer of jovial banter. My father looked at me, his eyes hard and expectant. He has a point, Kendall. You're almost 28. You can't hide behind contract work forever. You should look at Preston's work ethic. Look at what a real financial professional achieves through focus and pedigree. You could learn a great deal from him if you stopped being so stubborn. Heat rose in my neck, but not from shame. It was the icy, electrifying rush of adrenaline that happens right before a predator steps into a trap. I looked directly at Preston. His eyes read as bright with triumph. Everything in his posture told me he believed he had dominated the table, that he had reduced me to a punching bag, and cemented his status as the undisputed apex predator in the Vance household. I find quantitative risk modeling quite fulfilling, Preston. I said, my voice steady, smooth, and utterly devoid of anger. The beauty of numbers is that they don't care about charm or salesmanship. The ledger always balances in the end. Discrepancies have a way of revealing themselves no matter how carefully someone tries to disguise the underlying risk. Preston's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny, imperceptible flicker of uncertainty crossed his pupils before his bravado rushed back in. Well, Preston scoffed, picking up his dessert fork. That sounds like something people say when they don't have real capital on the line. Indeed, I said softly, picking up my glass of water. Let's see how the capital performs. The next morning at 6:00 a.m., the Atlanta skyline was barely visible through a thick gray mist. In my loft apartment in Inman Park, a space that was minimalist, meticulously organized and equipped with a triple-monitor workstation secured by enterprise-grade hardware encryption, I sat with a mug of black coffee staring at a blank spreadsheet. Preston Sterling's words from the night before weren't what bothered me. I had endured 20 years of my parents' shallow criticisms. I had built an impenetrable psychological fortress against their disdain. I want to be honest about something. I had harbored a low-grade unease about Preston Sterling since. On the first evening, Harper introduced him 6 months prior, but unease is not evidence, and in the Vance family, raising a concern without ironclad documentation was not a conversation, it was a character indictment. I had learned that lesson young, so I had stayed quiet, waiting for the specific kind of mistake that a man like Preston would eventually make in front of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Last night he had made it. What kept me awake now was not anger. It was the structural impossibility of his claims. A man managing $50 million in private equity does not mix up basic clearinghouse protocols. A legitimate fund manager does not describe liquidity pools using terminology that belongs in a late-night multi-level marketing infomercial. I opened an encrypted terminal window and initiated a basic open-source intelligence scan. I started with the corporate registries. The Georgia Secretary of State database listed Sterling Point Capital, LLC, as a domestic limited liability company formed 24 months prior. Its registered agent was a commercial registered agent service located in a strip mall in Alpharetta. The principal office address was a virtual co-working space in Midtown Atlanta, a $20 a month digital mailbox that provided a shiny street address for entities with no physical footprint. I pulled the FINRA broker check records. Nothing. Preston Sterling held no active Series 7, Series 65, or Series 66 licenses. He was not registered as an investment advisor representative IAR with either the state of Georgia or the Securities and Exchange Commission SEC. A search of SEC EDGAR filings for Form D, the mandatory notice of exempt offering of securities that every legitimate private equity or hedge fund must file when raising private capital, yielded 0 results for Sterling Point Capital or any variant thereof. Preston Sterling was not running an investment fund. He was operating an unregistered private collection pool out of a virtual mailbox. I picked up my phone and dialed an encrypted signal number. The call connected to the second ring. A raspy, caffeine-fueled voice answered. Reeves Forensic Intelligence. Tell me you have something more interesting than corporate tax evasion, Kendall. Marcus Reeves was a former colleague from my early days at a financial risk consultancy in Chicago. He was an absolute savant in forensic blockchain analysis, corporate entity tracing, and digital banking paper trails. He worked as an independent financial investigator for boutique litigation firms, and he possessed the curiosity of an apex bloodhound. Marcus, I said, leaning back in my chair. I need an institutional background check and a deep asset trace on an entity called Sterling Point Capital LLC and its managing director, Preston Sterling. Give me the parameters, Marcus said, the clatter of mechanical keys immediately rattling across the line. He's claiming to run a private equity alpha fund out of Atlanta. High-yield promissory returns claims of 30+% annualized gains, non-accredited retail investor solicitations disguised as private placements. He has no FINRA licensure and no SEC Form D filings. Marcus let out a low whistle. Smells like a garden variety affinity Ponzi. What's your angle on this? Is this for your firm? No, I replied, staring out at the rain streaking down my window. He just proposed to my sister. There was a 5-second silence on the line. Ouch, Marcus muttered. Family gatherings must be a bloodbath. Give me 10 days. This kind of cross-state entity mapping takes time if you want it to hold up. I have access to private litigation databases, offshore entity filings in Delaware, Nevada, and the Caymans, and secondary ledger tracing. If this guy has bought a cup of coffee with client funds, I'll find the receipt. Send the invoice to my personal account. Full forensic tier, I instructed. On it. For the next 2 days, I went about my normal work building risk-neutral volatility models for my New York firm during the day while running background queries on my personal system at night. On the following Wednesday evening, 8 days after my call to Marcus, my phone chimed with an encrypted 70-page PDF accompanied by a single text message. Call me the second you open this. It's worse than you thought. Way worse. I downloaded the file onto an air-gapped drive and opened the dossier. The wire transfer records themselves had not come from Marcus directly. 3 days earlier, while helping my mother sort through a stack of financial correspondence she had left unattended on the kitchen counter during one of Harper's fitting appointments, I had photographed the confirmation statements myself. My mother had assumed I was helping her file them. I had said nothing to correct that assumption. The documents Marcus incorporated into the dossier were sourced from those photographs, cross-referenced against the public court exhibits from the Florida litigation filings, where Sterling Point Capital's transaction patterns had already been entered into the public record, dating back 8 years. Preston was not an Ivy League heir. He had attended a third-tier unaccredited business college for 3 semesters before dropping out. His career consisted of a trail of failed ventures, an unauthorized Forex trading academy in Florida that had been shut down via a cease and desist letter by the state attorney general, an exotic car rental brokerage that had collapsed under a mountain of unpaid leases, and a series of private investment syndicates that followed a chillingly identical pattern. Preston would target country clubs, charity galas, and affluent suburban enclaves. He would establish a lavish lifestyle on credit-leased supercars, rented penthouses, designer watches, bought on secondary installment plans, and use that manufactured image of wealth to seduce wealthy, unsophisticated marks. He would promise them guaranteed returns of 25 to 35%, claiming he had an exclusive, algorithmic arbitrage pipeline. He would take their money, deposit it into personal shell accounts, pay out small monthly dividends, using incoming capital from newer victims to keep them docile and siphon the rest into his personal luxury expenses. When the liquidity ran dry, he would fabricate an unforeseen market liquidation event, fold the LLC, settle small claims out of court with non-disclosure agreements funded by his next round of victims, and relocate to a new city. Marcus had tracked 18 separate civil complaints across North Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee. Total estimated investor losses, $4.6 million. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the bank transaction summaries Marcus had pieced together from public court exhibits and corporate registry filings. But as I reached Section 4 of the report, my breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. In the middle of the ledger for Sterling Point Capital's primary operating account at a regional bank in Georgia, dated just 3 months prior, sat a single wire transfer. Date May 14. Originating account Arthur E. Vance and Eleanor M. Vance. Revocable Living Trust. Primary Custody Account. Amount $6. Memo Sterling Point Capital Series A Preferred Allocation. I stared at the numbers, unable to blink. $650,000. That was my parents' entire liquid cash reserve, the liquid capital my father had accumulated from 30 years of law practice and rolled over from his 401k pension buyout. My hands began to shake, but the nightmare was not finished. Directly beneath that entry was a second transaction dated 4 weeks later, date June 11. Originating institution first, Southern National Bank, home equity line of credit, HELOC disbursement. Borrowers, Arthur E. Vance and Eleanor M. Vance. Property collateral 4420 West Paces Ferry RD Atlanta GA. Disbursement amount, $5,000. Beneficiary Sterling Point Capital LLC. Total transferred $200,000. Preston hadn't just mocked me at the dinner table. He hadn't just seduced my vain status-obsessed sister. He had completely hollowed out my parents. I had convinced Arthur and Eleanor to liquidate their entire retirement savings and take out a maximum equity mortgage against their family home, the very house where we grew up, and hand it all over to his fraudulent shell company. I scrolled down to the forensic flow of funds chart Marcus had generated. The $1.2 million had not been invested in any market. It hadn't purchased a single share of stock, bond, or derivative. Within 72 hours of receiving my parents' funds, $180,000 had been wired to a luxury dealership to purchase the midnight blue Porsche Taycan outright. $95,000 had been transferred to a high-end jeweler in the Buckhead Village district for Harper's custom 3-carat diamond ring. $140,000 had been wired to luxury event planners, florists, and the Blue Ridge Mountain Estate to fund the extravagant wedding Harper had been bragging about. $40,000 had been wired through a series of intermediary domestic accounts into an offshore private holding account at a bank in Grand Cayman under the entity name Aegis Horizon Holdings Ltd, with Preston Sterling listed as the sole signatory. The remaining balance had been used to pay monthly yield distributions to earlier angry victims in Florida who had been threatening him with criminal complaints. My parents had funded their own daughter's luxury wedding, their future son-in-law's sports car, and a con artist's offshore escape hatch, using the deed to their own home. And they had no idea. They thought they were financial geniuses enjoying 30% returns. I sat in the dark of my apartment. What the forensic record could not capture, but what I understood with cold clarity, was the precise mechanism. Preston had used to bypass my father's professional instincts. He had not approached Arthur as a salesman, he had approached him as a peer. 3 of my father's closest associates from the Cherokee Town and Country Club men, whose judgment Arthur had trusted for decades, had already committed capital to Sterling Point Capital and were receiving their fabricated monthly yield statements on schedule. Preston had engineered social proof before he ever sat down at our dining table. By the time he asked Arthur to commit, my father was not making an investment decision. He was making a social one. He was joining a club. And Arthur Vance had spent his entire life believing that belonging to the right club was the highest form of intelligence. My hands resting on the edge of the glass desk. The impulse that rose within me was primal. Pick up the phone call. My father scream at him to look at the paperwork, demand that he call the FBI. But then the echo of my father's voice rang in my ears. Freelance dabbling. Look at Preston. You could learn a great deal from him if you stopped being so stubborn. I remembered my mother's haughty laugh. I remembered Harper's smug, patronizing pity. If I called them now with a PDF, what would happen? My father would call me jealous. He would accuse me of trying to sabotage my sister's happiness out of spite. My mother would declare that I was throwing a tantrum because I couldn't stand seeing Harper marry a successful man. Preston would look at them with soulful, wounded eyes, fabricate a smooth lie about confidential hedging strategies and routine corporate asset restructuring. And my parents would believe him. They would close ranks against me, sign whatever indemnification paperwork Preston put in front of them, and cast me out as the bitter, toxic black sheep. Preston would walk away with Harper with their $1.2 million and with the offshore funds securely out of reach of American courts. A standard warning would not work. A private conversation would be buried under their collective narcissism. If an illusion is built on public pride, it can only be destroyed by public truth. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Kendall," Marcus answered. "Did you see it?" "I saw it," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was cold, precise, and completely steady. "Marcus, I need you to do two things for me. First, I need certified, notarized copies of the SEC non-registration status, the civil judgment dockets from Florida, the bank wire records tracing the HELOC funds, and the Grand Cayman corporate registry filing for Aegis Horizon Holdings." "Done. What's the second thing?" "I need you to format every single document, every bank transfer receipt, and every text message into high-resolution uncompressed presentation slides. 16:9 aspect ratio, ultra-high definition." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Marcus let out a slow, wicked chuckle. "You're going to do it at the wedding, aren't you? Harper asked me yesterday if I would manage the audio-visual coordinator and run the bridal memory video on the grand LED display during the reception," I said softly. "It would be terribly rude of me to decline." The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological discipline. I attended the bridal fittings. I nodded politely when Harper spent 45 minutes lecturing me on the importance of curating an aspirational guest experience. I smiled when my mother fretted over whether the imported Italian table runners matched the champagne-tinted silk draping. Whenever Preston was in the room, he treated me with the same easy, dismissive arrogance. He had already won in his mind. He had secured the Vance family's capital, neutralized their daughter with romantic intoxication, and positioned himself as the savior of their generational wealth. "Kendall, sweetie," Harper said to me over lunch 2 weeks before the wedding, pushing a thumb drive across the marble cafe table. "This has all the photos of Preston and me from our trips to St. Bart's, Aspen, and Amalfi. The AV company at the Blue Ridge Estate said they have a massive 300-inch direct-view LED wall behind the main stage. I want the tribute video to play right after Arthur finishes his father of the bride toast. It needs to be emotional, cinematic, and flawless." "I'll make sure it's unforgettable, Harper," I said, taking the thumb drive and sliding it into my purse. "Thank you," she sighed, checking her reflection in her compact mirror. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye on things, Kendall. You're just so detached from everything. But having you handle the media production takes a huge weight off my shoulders. Just make sure the transitions are smooth." "The transitions will be seamless, I promise." 2 days before the event, Harper called me with a sudden burst of bridal anxiety. "Actually, Kendall, Preston wants to review the video before Saturday. He said he wants to approve it personally. Can you send him a preview copy tonight?" I had anticipated this. "Of course," I said. "I'll send him the first cut within the hour." I exported the first 45 seconds of the file, the romantic slideshow complete with the acoustic guitar score and the Positano photographs as a standalone preview clip, and sent it to Preston's email directly. It was technically accurate. It was simply not the complete file. Preston replied 40 minutes later with a single line, "Perfect. Exactly what I wanted." I set my phone face down on the desk. Behind the scenes, I worked with surgical precision. Marcus delivered the finalized evidence package. We built a custom presentation file wrapped in an executable container. The first 45 seconds of the video file contained the romantic slideshow Harper had requested, soft acoustic strings, high-definition photographs of Harper and Preston posing on yachts in the Mediterranean, smiling over vintage wine in Napa, embracing on private jet tarmac runways. At the 46-second mark, the audio track was programmed to drop into total silence. From that point forward, the presentation transitioned into an automated animated forensic timeline of Sterling Point Capital LLC. Slide 1, the State of Georgia, Corporate Registry, listing the Alpharetta Strip Mall mailbox, alongside SEC verification showing 0 investment advisor registrations. Slide 2, high-resolution scans of the 3 active default judgments and civil fraud complaints from the Orange County Court in Florida, detailing $2.4 million in unrecovered investor funds. Slide 3, the certified bank statement from First Southern National Bank showing the $550,000 home equity line of credit drawn against 4420 West Paces Ferry Road, signed by Arthur and Eleanor Vance. Slide 4, the flow of funds diagram, showing the immediate disbursement of those funds into the purchase of Preston's Portia Harper's engagement ring and the wedding venue invoice. Slide 5, The Cayman Islands Monetary Authority Registry document for Aegis Horizon Holdings Ltd, displaying Preston Sterling as the sole beneficial owner, alongside the wire transfer confirmation of $450,000 sent to that offshore account just 17 days prior. Slide 6. High-definition screenshots of text messages recovered from the Florida civil litigation discovery cache in which Preston bragged to an associate, "The old man is an easy mark. He thinks he's getting 30% alpha. I'm taking their house equity to pay off the Miami debt and funding the wedding on his dime. Once the ring is on, they can't touch me without destroying their own precious social standing." I tested the file on multiple operating systems, ensured the audio codecs were universal, and encrypted the master payload onto a dual-interface solid-state drive to ensure there could be no interference from the venue's on-site technicians. I contacted the production company hired for the event, introduced myself as the authorized family media coordinator, and arranged to plug my personal laptop directly into the primary switcher via HDMI and SDI bypass. I told them the family had prepared a proprietary high bitrate ProRes master file that required dedicated hardware playback. They were more than happy to let me handle the execution. 4 days before the event, I received a final phone call from my father. "Kendall," he barked into the receiver, "I trust you have your attire sorted out for Saturday. We have partners from 3 major law firms and 2 federal judges attending. Preston has several high-profile institutional investors flying in from New York. I don't want any eccentricities. Dress appropriately, keep your conversations brief, and try to smile." "I have everything under control, Dad," I replied evenly. "Good. This is a monumental day for this family. Preston is setting up a secondary tranche for us next month. We're looking at rolling over another line of credit into his new tech fund. It's about time this family started building real exponential wealth." A cold shudder ran down my spine. Preston wasn't finished. He was planning to extract whatever borrowing power my parents had left before disappearing. "I will see you on Saturday, Dad," I said. "Don't be late," he said and hung up. Saturday arrived under an ominous, suffocating blanket of late summer heat. The Blue Ridge Mountain Estate was an opulent modern compound perched on a ridge overlooking a sweeping North Georgia valley. The architecture was an aggressive combination of steel beams, floor-to-ceiling glass, and rough-hewn mountain stone. 250 guests had gathered in the estate's grand pavilion. The air inside was chilled to a crisp 68 degrees, scented with thousands of cascading white gardenias and eucalyptus branches. Everywhere I looked, the guests were dressed in black-tie perfection, men in midnight blue tuxedos, women in designer floor-length silk gowns, diamond necklaces glittering under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Preston moved through the crowd during the cocktail hour like a reigning monarch. Preston moved through the cocktail crowd like a man who had rehearsed this exact room his entire life, working each cluster of guests with a different register of charm, calibrating his laugh, his lean, his level of eye contact to match whatever each target needed to feel seen. I watched him do it from across the pavilion and recognized it for exactly what it was, a professional performance running on borrowed time that had every wealthy retiree in the room leaning in to catch his every word. Harper was incandescent. Her gown was a bespoke lace creation with an 8-foot train. She looked triumphant, as though she had finally secured the ultimate prize, a handsome, wealthy, brilliant husband who would elevate her into the highest stratosphere of Southern society. My parents were practically levitating with pride. My mother was holding court near the grand ice sculpture, accepting effusive congratulations from her country club peers. My father stood near the bar with 3 retired appellate judges, his chest puffed out, swirling his scotch and loudly discussing the necessity of private equity exposure in a volatile market. I walked into the tech booth at the rear of the pavilion. The media technician, a young man named Tyler, was adjusting the audio levels on the soundboard. The massive 300-inch direct-view LED wall at the front of the ballroom, positioned directly behind the head table where the bridegroom and parents would sit, was currently displaying a soft ambient graphic of the couple's monogram H&P. "Hey, Kendall," Tyler said, looking up with a friendly nod. "Are you ready for the tribute video?" "All set, Tyler," I said, opening my laptop and connecting the high-speed HDMI output directly into the primary video switcher. "I have the master feed queued up on channel 1. When Mr. Vance finishes his toast, the master house lights will dim automatically, right? Yup. Stage manager calls for house lights down to 10% spot on the main LED wall and audio feed goes hot on channels 7 and 8. You just hit the spacebar on your rig and the switcher takes over. Perfect, I murmured. I'll run it from here. At 7:30 p.m., the chimes sounded signaling dinner was complete and the formal toasts were about to begin. The caterers cleared the dessert plates. The chatter subsided into an expectant celebratory murmur. Arthur Vance walked up to the small podium set up at the edge of the stage, tapping his microphone. The room immediately silenced. Friends, family, and distinguished guests. Arthur began, his voice resonant, polished by decades of courtroom rhetoric. Tonight, Eleanor and I are filled with an overwhelming sense of joy. As parents, your greatest hope is that your children will find partners who not only cherish them, but who match their character, their ambition, and their drive for excellence. He turned toward the head table, gesturing grandly with his champagne flute. Preston, from the moment you walked into our lives, you showed us what true leadership looks like. You brought brilliance, vision, and an uncompromising standard of success into our family. You have not only captured our daughter's heart, but you have earned the absolute trust, respect, and admiration of everyone in this room. Harper wiped away a delicate tear with a silk handkerchief. Preston smiled, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of humble gratitude. We welcome you as our son. Arthur continued, his voice swelling with emotion. And we look forward to the incredible future you and Harper will build together. Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses to Harper and Preston. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Glasses clinked. Cheers echoed through the high vaulted ceiling. And now, Arthur announced, waving toward the grand display, my daughter Kendall has prepared a special visual tribute celebrating the journey of love that brought Harper and Preston to this magnificent day. Please direct your attention to the main screen. Arthur stepped down from the podium and took his seat beside my mother at the head table. Preston took Harper's hand, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied, expectant smile, ready to be glorified before 250 of Atlanta's elite. In the tech booth, Tyler looked at me. The stage is set, Kendall. Roll it. Rolling, I said. I pressed the spacebar. The overhead chandeliers dimmed to a soft, moody glow. The 300-inch LED screen illuminated with razor-sharp brilliance. A gentle, romantic acoustic guitar melody swelled through the Meyer Sound concert speakers. The screen showed Harper and Preston standing on the sun-drenched cliffs of Positano, their arms wrapped around each other, laughing into the wind. Harper and Preston, a love built on truth and vision, the elegant gold typography read across the screen. The audience let out a collective soft, "Aw." Harper leaned her head onto Preston's shoulder. Preston smiled smoothly, taking a sip of his champagne. Another photo appeared, the couple at a black tie gala in Manhattan, looking stunning, powerful, untouchable. Then came the 46-second mark. Without warning, the music cut out entirely. The pavilion was plunged into dead absolute silence. The romantic photograph did not fade into another portrait. It vanished instantly, replaced by a stark high-contrast, black and white graphic, displaying a massive header in bold industrial lettering. Subject: Preston Sterling. Sterling Point Capital, LLC investigation conducted by Co-Forensic Intelligence. A ripple of confused muttering stirred through the front tables. Preston frowned, sitting up straighter. Harper blinked, her smile freezing. Before anyone could speak, the screen transitioned to slide 1. A massive high-definition scan of the Georgia Secretary of State corporate filing filled the 300-inch display. The address: Suite 104, Line 184, Alpharetta Highway. The UPS store was circled in glowing red. Beneath it, an official FINRA broker check certificate was displayed with a massive red stamp across the center. No licensure. No registered investment advisor status. What is this? Arthur's voice boomed from the head table, sharp with sudden irritation. Tyler, fix the slide. Someone put up the wrong file. Tyler panicked, furiously hitting buttons on the backup board. It's not responding. The primary feed has an administrative override lock. The screen jumped to slide 2. The 3 civil judgment dockets from the state of Florida appeared, magnified to 20 feet wide. Plaintiffs: Marcus and Brenda Holloway, Dr. Robert Vance. No relation: Elena Rostova. Cause of action: fraudulent misrepresentation, unregistered securities solicitation, grand larceny. Outstanding unpaid judgments $2,400. Status default judgment entered. Writ of execution pending. A loud collective gasp tore through the audience. At table 4, one of my father's former judicial colleagues put on his reading glasses, leaned forward, and let out an audible "Good God Almighty." Preston's face drained of every drop of color. The smug patrician composure vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed paralyzing terror. He dropped his champagne glass. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, sending champagne splashing over Harper's pristine white gown. "Turn it off!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently into a high-pitched shriek. "Turn it off right now! This is a malicious cyber attack. Pull the power." Harper looked at him, completely paralyzed, her mouth hanging open in horror. "Preston, what are they showing? What is that?" The screen advanced to slide 3. The image changed to a crystal-clear scan of a bank transfer authorization form from First Southern National Bank. At the top were the names of the account holders highlighted in bright yellow: Arthur E. Vance and Eleanor M. Vance. Directly beneath was the collateral description: home equity mortgage, 4420 West Paces Ferry RD. Total loan disbursement, $550,000. Prior retirement liquidation, $650,000. Total transfer to Sterling Point Capital, $200,000. So, my mother let out a strangled, breathless cry, grabbing her chest. "Arthur! Arthur, what is our house deed doing on the screen?" Arthur stood up from his chair so violently that it tipped over backward, crashing to the floor. His face was mottled with a terrifying crimson rage. "What is the meaning of this? Who authorized this?" The screen advanced to slide 4, the flow of funds. An interactive animated chart mapped out the exact trajectory of my parents' $1.2 million, 180,000 Porsche Financial Services Taycan Turbo S, purchased by Preston Sterling. 25,000 Buckhead Village Fine Jewelers 3.2 CT engagement ring. 140,000 Blue Ridge Mountain Estate and Event Production Tonight's Wedding. 450,000 Aegis Horizon Holdings Luti, account number 884901 Cayman National Bank. Beneath the chart, the Grand Cayman Corporate Registry document flashed onto the screen, showing the sole owner-director and signatory of Aegis Horizon Holdings, Preston Sterling. The entire ballroom descended into pandemonium. 250 of the wealthiest, most influential people in Georgia were staring at a 20-foot-tall breakdown of a criminal Ponzi scheme operating in real time on the bridal stage. Guests were pulling out their smartphones, taking photos and videos of the screen. Whispers escalated into a deafening roar of shock and disgust. Preston lunged toward the stage, trying to scramble over the floral arrangements to reach the video cables. "It's fake. It's a forged document. She's lying. She's trying to destroy me." Then came slide 5. The screen showed the full-resolution screenshot of Preston's private text messages from the Florida Discovery Archive. The text was magnified so large that it could be read from the back row of the pavilion. "The old man is an easy mark. He thinks he's getting 30% alpha. I'm taking their house equity to pay off the Miami debt and funding the wedding on his dime. Once the ring is on, they can't touch me without destroying their own precious social standing." The words hung in the air like a physical execution. Harper stared at the screen, then turned to look at Preston. Her face was completely contorted in shock, tears streaming through her mascara, destroying the flawless bridal makeup she had spent 4 hours perfecting. "You used my parents' house!" Harper shrieked, her voice echoing through the pavilion without a microphone. "You used my parents' home to pay for your car, to pay for this wedding." "Harper, listen to me. It's out of context. She hacked my system. It's a setup." Preston stammered, backing away from her, his hands trembling violently, his custom, Tom Ford tuxedo, suddenly looking like an oversized costume on a shivering child. Arthur Vance stumbled forward toward the edge of the stage, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support, his eyes wide with an absolute soul-crushing horror. He looked at the bank records. He looked at his own signature blown up to 10 feet tall on the screen. He looked at the offshore transfer confirmation to the Cayman Islands. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had not made an exclusive high-yield 30% investment. He was not a sophisticated venture capitalist. He had been swindled by a con artist who had flattered his ego, used his own home as collateral, and spent his life savings on a sports car and a luxury party. I stepped out of the tech booth. I picked up the wireless handheld microphone from the sound desk, turned it on, and walked slowly down the center aisle of the pavilion. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted instantly, 250 pairs of eyes fixing on me in dead, terrified silence. I stopped at the foot of the stage, looking up at the wreckage of the Vance family dynasty. My mother was sobbing hysterically, slumped over the linen tablecloth. Harper was on her knees, hyperventilating into the train of her wedding dress. Preston was pressed against the back wall of the stage, cornered, his eyes darting frantically toward the emergency exits. Arthur turned his head slowly, looking down at me with an expression of shattered, pleading disbelief. "Kendall," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling through the microphone in my hand. "Kendall, what did you do?" I looked my father straight in the eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sneer. I didn't gloat. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a woman who dealt only in undeniable mathematical facts. "I didn't do anything, Dad," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the silent ballroom. "I just ran the numbers. The numbers you said were meaningless." I turned my gaze to Preston, whose chest was heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. "Your Cayman account has already been flagged under a temporary asset freeze application submitted to the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia this afternoon," I said smoothly. "The SEC Division of Enforcement received a complete copy of this forensic dossier at 4:00 p.m. today. The federal marshals are likely waiting at your apartment in Midtown right now." Preston collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. I turned back to my father. "Your retirement savings and the deed to your house didn't go into a high-yield fund, Dad. They were transferred into the offshore account of your prize son-in-law, the man you told me I should learn from, the man you laughed with while you called me unemployed." Arthur's mouth moved, but no sound came out. A single heavy tear rolled down his aged cheek, cutting through the polished veneer of a man who had spent his entire life valuing the illusion of wealth over the dignity of truth. I laid the microphone gently down on the edge of the stage. I looked at Harper, whose weeping had dissolved into a silent, hollow stare at the shattered crystal on the floor. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel triumph. I felt completely, magnificently free. I turned around and walked back down the center aisle of the pavilion. The silence around me was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. No one spoke. No one reached out to stop me. No one dared to look me in the eye. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Blue Ridge estate and stepped out into the cool mountain night. The Georgia air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth after the evening rain. The valley below stretched out into an ocean of quiet darkness. I walked to my Subaru, unlocked the door, and sat in the driver's seat. I tossed the presentation drive onto the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the steady, reliable hum of the engine. As I pulled out of the private driveway and drove down the winding mountain road, leaving the flashing smartphone cameras, the hysterical weeping, and the ruins of an empire behind me, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The lights of the estate faded into the mist. Sometimes the family you are born into does not exist to protect you. Sometimes they assign you a role in a play you never agreed to perform. And sometimes walking away isn't an act of cruelty, it is the only way to preserve your own reality. I turned onto the highway, pressed my foot to the accelerator, and drove into the quiet, unburdened night.